Guys, so last night I finished A Wrinkle in Time, and sorry for having that take so long, but I really wanted to finish that up because, as you know, love wins. So that's the really important message of that book. But I wanted to also do a bit of a read aloud from one of the novellas in Cory Doctorow's novel called Radicalized. That's the name of the novella. It has the book, and it has four different short stories in them. They're about 100 pages, so it's sort of a long story. I think I'll probably split it over a couple of readings. But, I just finished posting last week sort of a long write-up that I had done around refugees and charter cities and impact investing and Internet of Things, cyber physical systems and smart contracts, and how this is all layered in with faith communities. And I know there are probably a lot of people who maybe follow the standard narratives, and they're like, I don't really get why this is relevant to what I care about. But I'm saying it all is because it comes after the refugees first, and sort of my early research after education was looking at blockchain identity that was being done through the United Nations, targeting specifically Syrian refugees and their kids for biometrics and retinal scan grocery payments, and the fact that Sesame Workshop and the International Rescue Committee and the MacArthur Foundation and the nudge units were all in on these refugee camps and putting tablets into the hands of kids and monitoring children through the devices, and then also layering on sort of family-based interventions and digital surveillance. And so really they come and go after the most vulnerable people first, because who's going to really stand up for displaced people? And especially if you have the UN involved or other people, most people assume that they're all good and that they're all doing the right thing for the right reasons. But they're not. They're test beds. And so I wanted to read this first story, and it's called Unauthorized Bread. It's the first story in the novella. And I think the fact that I started reading sci-fi actually once I started doing my research, because I realized like it actually isn't that fictional. It's sort of near future dystopia, and it helped me understand some things. And, there's a short story called On the Domestic Front, and that's about Internet of Things, a guy and his Internet of Things house. And there's another one, I forget the name of it, but it's about, I've mentioned it before, this divorce that was precipitated by a ride sharing app that would put together people that they thought would have a good rapport for their ride share to work, and sort of essentially cultivated lots of adultery in the ride share app, and that it was all automated and all on smart contracts. So I thought I would just go back. I read this a number of years ago, but that I would read it for you guys, because I would encourage, if you haven't taken the time to look through what I pulled together about the refugees, it's actually really relevant and important. And I think I was able to write it and sort of put the pieces together because of things that I've read. And, I've read things as fiction and realized they're not actually fiction. You just fast forward 10 or 20 years and we're there. So, so I'm going to start. It's about 100 pages, so I don't think I'll definitely not get through this today, but, I'm thinking maybe 3 different reading sessions, because it's not that long to get done. So Unauthorized Bread, and this is the first read aloud section. The way Salima found out that Boulangism had gone bankrupt. Her toaster wouldn't accept her bread. She held the slice in front of it and waited for the screen to show her a thumbs up emoji. But instead, it showed her the head scratching face and made a soft brrrt. She waved the bread again. Brrrt. Come on, brrrt. She turned the toaster off and on again, and then she unplugged it, and she counted to 10, and she plugged it in, and then she menued through the screens until she found reset to factory default. And she waited 3 minutes and punched her Wi-Fi password in again. Bert? Long before she got to that point, she'd grown certain that it was a lost cause. But these were the steps that you took when the electronics stopped working, so that you could call the 800 number and say, I've turned it off and on, I've unplugged it, I've reset the factory defaults, and there was a touch screen option on the toaster to call support, but that wasn't working. And so she used the fridge to look up the number and call it. It rang 17 times and disconnected. She heaved a sigh. Another one bites the dust. The toaster wasn't the first appliance to go. That honor went to the dishwasher, which stopped being able to validate third-party dishes the week before when Disher went under. But it was the last straw. She could, but it was she could wash dishes in the sink. But how the hell was she supposed to make toast over a candle? Just to be sure, she asked the fridge for headlines about boulangism, and there it was. Her cloud had burst in the night, and socials were crawling with people furious about their daily bread. She prodded a headline and learned that boulangism had been a ghost ship for at least 6 months, because that's how long security researchers had been contacting the company to tell it that all its user data, passwords, login, ordering, and billing details had been hanging out there on the public internet with no password or encryption. There were ransom notes in the database, records extorted by hackers demanding cryptocurrency payouts in exchange for keeping the dirty secrets of boulangism's shitty data handling. And no one had even seen them. Boulangism's share price had declined by 98% over the past year. There might not even be a boulangism anymore. When Salima had pictured boulangism, she'd imagined the French bakery that was on the toaster's idle screen, dusted with flour, woodblock tables with serried ranks of crusty loaves, and she'd pictured a rickety staircase leading up from the bakery to a suite of cramped offices overlooking a cobbled road. She'd pictured gas lamps. The article had a street view shot of Boulangism's headquarters, a 4-story office block in Pune near Mumbai, walled in with an unattended guard booth at the street entrance. Boulangism's cloud had burst, and that meant that there was no one answering Salima's toaster when it asked if the bread she was about to toast had come from an authorized Boulangism baker, which it had. In the absence of a reply, the paranoid little gadget would assume that Salima was in the class of nefarious fraudsters who bought a discounted Boulangism toaster and then tried to renege on her end of the bargain by inserting unauthorized bread, which had the consequences ranging from kitchen fires to suboptimal toast. Boulangism was able to adjust its toasting routine in real time to adjust for relative kitchen humidity and the age of the bread, and of course, it would refuse to toast bread that had become unsalvageably stale, to say nothing of the loss of profits for the company and its shareholders. Without those profits, there would be no surplus capital to divert to R&D, creating the continuous improvement that it meant that hardly a day went by without Salima and millions of other Boulangism stakeholders, never just customers, waking up with exciting new firmware for their beloved toasters. And what of the Boulangism baker partners? Well, they'd done the right thing, signing up for a Boulangism license, subjecting their process to inspections and quality assurance that meant that their bread had exactly the right composition to toast perfectly in Boulangism's precision-engineered appliances with crumb and porosity in perfect balance to absorb butter and other spreads. These valued partners deserved to have their commitment to excellence honored, not cast aside by a bargain hunting cheater who wanted to recklessly toast any old bread. Salima knew these arguments even before her stupid toaster played the video explaining them, which it did after 3 unsuccessful bread authorization attempts, playing out without a pause or a mute button as a combination of punishment and re-education campaign. She tried to search her fridge for Boulangism's hacks and Boulangism unlock codes, but the appliances stuck together. KitchenAid's network filters gobbled up her queries and spat back snarky, "No results" screens, even though Salima knew perfectly well that there was a whole underground economy devoted to unauthorized bread. She had to leave for work in half an hour and she hadn't even showered yet, but god damn it, first the dishwasher and now the toaster? She found her laptop, used when she'd gotten it and now barely functional. Its battery was long dead, and she had to unplug her toothbrush to free up a charger cable. But after she had booted it and let it run dozens of software updates, she was able to run the darknet browser she still had kicking around and do some judicious Googling. She was 45 minutes late to work that day, but she had toast for breakfast, god damn it. The dishwasher was next. And once Salima had found the right forum, it would have been crazy not to unlock the thing. I mean, after all, she had to use it, and now it was effectively bricked. I mean, she wasn't the only one who had the Disher Boulangism double whammy either. Some poor suckers also had the poor fortune to own one of the constellation of devices made by HP News Corp, fridges, toothbrushes, even sex toys, all of which had gone down thanks to a failure of the company's cloud provider, Tata. And while this failure was unrelated to Disher Boulangism doubleheader, it was pretty unfortunate timing, everyone agreed. The twin collapse of Disher and Boulangism did have a shared cause, Salima discovered. Both companies were publicly traded, and both had seen more than 20% of their shares acquired by Summerstream Funds Management, the largest hedge fund on earth, with its $184 billion under management. Summerstream was an activist shareholder, and it was very big on stock buybacks. And once it had a seat on each company's board, both occupied by Galt Baumgaudner, a junior partner at the firm, but from a very good Kansas family, they both hired the same expert consultant from Deloitte to examine the company's accounts and recommend a buyback program that would see the shareholders getting their due return from the firms without gouging them so deep that the company's operating capital was endangered. It was all mathematically provable, of course. The companies could easily afford to divert billions from their balance sheets to the shareholders. And once this was determined, it was the board's fiduciary duty to vote in favor of it, which was handy since they all owned fat wads of company shares. And a few $1 billion later, the companies were lean, mean, and battle ready and didn't even miss all that money. Oops. Summerstream issued a press release. Jason's channel is Argus Fest YouTube. Summerstream issued a press release, often quoted in the forum Salima was now obsessively haunting, blaming the whole thing on volatility and alpha and calling it unfortunate and disappointing. They were confident that both companies would restructure the bankruptcy, perhaps after a quick sale to a competitor, and everyone could start toasting bread and wash his dishes within a month or two. Salima wasn't going to wait. Her Boulangism didn't go easily. After downloading the new firmware from the darknet, she had to remove the case, slicing through 3 separate tamper-evident seals and a large warning sticker that threatened electrocution and prosecution, perhaps simultaneously, for anyone foolish enough to ignore it, and locate the specific component and then short out 2 of its pins with a pair of tweezers while booting it. And this dropped the toaster into a test mode that the developers had deactivated but not removed. The instant the test screen came up, she had to jam her USB stick. Removing the toaster's hood had revealed a set of USB ports, a monitor port, and even a little Ethernet jack, all stock on the commodity single-board PC that controlled it at exactly the right instant, and then use the on-screen keyboard to tap in the login and password, which were admin and admin, of course. It took her 3 tries to get the timing right, but on the 3rd try, the spare login screen was replaced with a pirate firmware's cheesy text art animation of a 3D skull, which she smiled at. And then she burst into laughter as a piece of text art toast floated into the frame and was merrily chomped into bits by her text art skull, the crumbs cascading to the bottom of the screen and forming shifting little piles. Someone had put a lot of effort into the physics simulation for that ridiculous animation. It made Salima feel good, like she was entrusting her toaster to deep, serious craftspeople and not just randos who like to pit their wits against faceless programmers from big, stupid companies. The crumbs piled up as the skull chomped, and the progress indicated counted up from 12% to 16%, and then to 34%, where it stuck for a full 10 minutes until she was ready to risk really bricking the damn thing by unplugging it. But then 58%, and so on to an agonizing wait at 99%. And then all of the crumbs rushed up from the bottom of the screen and went back out through the skull's mouth, turning back into toast, each reassembled piece forming up in ranks that quickly blotted out the skull, and the words, "all done," burned themselves into the toaster's surface, glistening with butter that ran down in rivulets. She was just grabbing her phone to get a picture of this awesome pirate load screen when the toaster oven blinked and rebooted itself. A few seconds later, she held a slice of bread to the toaster's sensors and watched as the light turned green and its door yawned open. And halfway through the munching of the toast, she was struck by an odd curiosity. She held her hand up to the toaster, palm out, as though it too were a slice of bread. And the toaster's light turned green and the door opened. And she was momentarily tempted to try and toast a fork or a paper towel or a slice of apple, just to see if the toaster would do it. But of course it would. This was a new kind of toaster, a toaster that took orders, Rather than giving them a toaster that could give her enough rope to hang herself, let her toast a lithium battery or a can of hairspray or anything she wanted to toast. Unauthorized bread, even homemade bread. The idea made her feel a little queasy and a little tremorous. Homemade bread was something she'd read about in books, seen in old dramas, but she didn't know anyone who actually baked bread. That was like gnawing your own furniture out of whole legs or something. The ingredients turned out to be incredibly simple, and while her first loaf came out looking like a poop emoji, it tasted amazing. Still warm from the little toaster, and if anything, the lump, she saved and toasted it the next morning, and it was even better, especially with butter on it. She left for work that day with a magical, warm, toasty feeling in her stomach. She did the dishwasher that night. The disher hackers were much more utilitarian in their approach, but they were also Swedish, judging from the URLs in the README files, which might explain the minimalism. And she'd been to an IKEA. She got it. The disher didn't require anything like the song and dance of the Boulangism, and she popped off the maintenance cover, pried the rubber gasket off the USB port, and stuck in her stick and rebooted it. The screen showed a lot of scrolling text and some cryptic error messages, and then rebooted again into what looked like a normal disher operating mode, except without the throbbing red alerts about the unreachable server that had haunted it for a week. She piled the dishes from the sink into the dishwasher, feeling a tiny thrill every time the dishwasher played its new dish recognized arpeggio. She thought about taking up pottery next. Her experience with the dishwasher and the toaster changed her, and though she couldn't quite say how at first, leaving the apartment the next day, she found herself eyeing up the elevator bank, looking at the fire department override plate under the call screen, thinking about the fact that the tenants on the subsidized floors had to wait 3 times as long for an elevator because they were only eligible to ride in the cars that had reopening doors that exited into the back lobby with its pour doors. Even those cars couldn't stop at her floor if they'd picked up one of the full fare residents along the way, because heaven forbid those people should have to breathe the common air of the filthy commoners. So I think, again, just picture. So what she's saying is that they're in a mixed housing development with subsidized housing and full price housing. And the people in the subsidized housing, it's a high rise, and they're not able to use the elevators unless there's no one using them from the high rise section. Okay. So if you're in the subsidized side of the building, you have to wait until everyone else has been served before you're allowed to even use the elevator. Okay. Salima had been overjoyed to get a spot in her building, the Dorchester Towers, because the waiting list for subsidy units that the planning department required of the developer was years deep. She'd been in the country for a decade at that point, spending the first 5 years in a camp in Arizona where they'd watched one person after another die in the withering heat. And when the State Department finally finished vetting her and letting her out, a caseworker met her with a bag of clothes, a prepaid debit card, and news that her parents had died while she was in the camp. She absorbed the news silently and didn't allow herself to display any outward sign of agony. And she had assumed that her parents had died because they'd promised to meet her in Arizona within a month of her arrival, just as soon as her father would call in his old debts and pay for the papers and database fiddling that would get him on the plane and to the U.S. immigration checkpoint where they could claim asylum. She'd been a teenager then, and now she was a grown woman with 5 years hard living in the camp behind her. She knew how to control her tears, and she thanked the caseworker and asked what had become of their bodies. Lost at sea, the woman said, and donned a compassionate mask. The ship and all the passengers, no survivors. The Italians scoured the area for weeks and found nothing. The wreck went straight to the bottom. Bad informatics, they said. A ship was a computer that you put desperate people inside, and when the computer went bad, the ship was a tomb. You put desperate people inside. She nodded like she understood, though the sound of her blood in her ears was so loud she couldn't hear herself think. The social worker said more things and gave her some paperwork, which included a Greyhound ticket to Boston, where she had found a shelter bed. She read the itinerary through 3 times. She'd learned to read English in the camp, taught by a woman who'd been a linguistics professor before she was a refugee. She'd learned geography from the mandatory civics lessons she'd gone to every 2 weeks, watching videos about life in America that were notably short on survival tips for life in the part of America where where they slept 3 deep in bunk beds in a blazing desert, surrounded by drones and barbed wire. She learned where Boston was, though. Far. Boston. 2 days, 17 hours, the social worker said. You'll get to see all of America. It's an incredible experience. Her mask slipped for a moment, and she looked very tired. And then she pasted her smile back on. Get to the grocery store first. That's my advice. You'll want some real food to eat. Salima had got good at being bored over 5 years in the camp, mastering a kind of waking doze where her mind simply went away, time scurrying past like roaches clinging to the baseboard, barely visible in the corner of her eye. But on the Greyhound bus, the skill failed her, even after she found a window seat, 22 hours into the journey. She found her mind returning again and again to her parents and the ship, the deep fathoms of the Mediterranean. She had known that her parents were dead, but there was knowing and there was knowing. She debarked in Boston 2 days and 17 hours later, noting as she did that the bus didn't have a driver, something she'd missed, boarding and debarking by the rear doors, another computer you put your body into. Given the wrong informatics, the Greyhound could have plunged off a cliff or smashed into oncoming traffic. There'd been a charge port on the armrest, and she'd shared it with the seatmates who'd come and gone on her bus. But she made sure she had a full charge when she stepped off the bus. It was good she did, as she used up almost all of her battery getting translations and directions in order to find the shelter she'd been assigned, which wasn't in Boston, but in a suburb called Worcester, whose pronunciation evaded her for the next 6 months. All of her groceries were consumed, and everything she owned fit in a duffel bag, whose strap broke as she was lugging it up a broken escalator while changing underground T trains on her way to Worcester. And she'd spent half the funds on her debit card on food, and she'd eaten like a mouse. I mean, like a bird, like a scurrying cockroach. She had started with nearly nothing, and now she had nothing. The hardest part of finding the shelter was the fact that it was in a dead strip mall. 11 stores, all refitted with bunks and showers and playrooms for kids. You guys are seeing this, right? You're seeing why it's so important that we write about the refugees. Okay. The dead strip mall. All refitted with bunks and showers and playrooms for kids, arranged along the back plane of an empty parking lot that was a half mile from the nearest bus stop. Salima walked past them all 3 times, staring at her phone, whose battery was nearly flat again. It was so old it barely held a charge before she figured out that this row of shops was her new home. The reception was in an old pharmacy that had anchored the mall. It was unattended, a cavernous place walled off by a roll-down gate with a row of touch screens where the cash registers had sat. It smelled of piss, and the floor was dirty with that kind of ancient ground and grime that you got in places where people trudged over and over. Only one of the touch screens was working, and it took a lot of trial and error before she figured out she needed to tap about 1.5 centimeters southwest of the button she was hitting. And once she clocked this, things got faster. She switched the screen to Arabic, and she let the camera over it scan her retinas. Yeah, the retinal scans. And repeatedly pressed her fingers to the pad until the machine had read her. And once it validated her, she had to tap through 8 screens of things she was promising. That she wouldn't drink or drug or steal, and that she didn't have any chronic or infectious diseases, and that she didn't support terrorism, and she understood that at this stage she was not permitted to work for wages, but also, and paradoxically, she would be required to work in Worcester in order to pay back the people of the United States for the shelter bed she was about to be assigned. She read the fine print. It was something she'd learned to do early in the refugee process. Sometimes the immigration officers quizzed you on the things you just clicked through, and if you couldn't answer their questions correctly, they'd send you to the back of the line or reschedule your hearing for the next month because you hadn't fully appreciated the gravity of the agreement that you were forging with the USA. And then she found out which of the former stores she'd been living in, and it was prompted to insert her debit card, which was topped up with credits she could exchange for food at specific stores that catered to people on benefits. And as she tapped through more screens and entered her phone number, choosing times for medical checkups, she began became aware of a low humming noise growing closer. And she turned around and saw a low trolley trundling through the aisles of the derelict pharmacy with a cardboard banker's box on it. It steered laboriously around corners and then moved to a gate set into the roll-down cage, which clunked open. And the screen prompted her to retrieve the box, which contained linens, a towel, a couple of 6-packs of white cotton underwear, T-shirts, a box of tampons, and a toilet bag with shampoos, soaps, and deodorants. It was the most functional transaction she'd had in years, and she wanted to kiss the stupid, unlovely little robot. She couldn't carry her box. See, now you wonder about all these CVS and all these corner pharmacies, right? There's going to be automated acceptance centers for all of our dispossessed people of the world, run by robots. Okay. She couldn't carry her box and her duffel bag at the same time, and she didn't want to let either of them out of her sight. So she staged them down the face of the strip mall, moving the box 10 paces, setting it down, and setting her duffel and carrying it 10 paces past the box, and then leapfrogging the box over the duffel. And her pile of papers from the kiosk included a map showing the location of her storefront near the end, of course. So it was a long way. And at the halfway mark, a woman came out of the store she just passed and regarded her with hands on hips, head cocked, and a small smile on her face. The woman was Somali. There'd been plenty in the camp, and no older than Salima, though she had a small child clinging to her legs, gender unknown. She wore overalls and a Boston University sweatshirt, and she had her hair in a kerchief. And for all that, she looked somehow stylish. Later, Salima would learn the woman, whose name was Nadifa, had come from a long line of seamstresses and would unpick the seams of any piece of clothing that fell into her hands and retailor them for her exact measurements. "You're new?" "I'm Salima. Yeah, I'm new." The woman cocked her head the other way. "Where are you staying? Show me." And she walked to Salima and held out her hand for the map. And Salima showed it to her, and she chucked her teeth. "That's no good. That one has bad heat, and the toilet never stops running. Here, let us fix that." And without asking, the woman hoisted her box and led her back to the office, Salima trailing after her alongside with the little child who kept sneaking her looks. The woman knew which screen worked and could land her finger at the exact southwestern offset needed to hit the buttons. Her fingers flew over the screen, and then she had Salima stand before the retina monitor and put her fingers on the scanner again. And a new paper emerged in the kiosk out tray. "Much better," the woman said. And Salima felt confused and a little anxious. Had this woman just moved her in with her family? I mean, was she to be a babysitter for the child who was staring at her again? But she didn't need to worry. Single women stayed in one of the 3 units and the families in 2 more. And Salima's new home, thanks to the woman who finally introduced herself, had once been in a nail salon, and its storeroom still had a few remnants of the old days. But it was now hung with heavy, sound-absorbing blankets made out of some sort of synthetic fiber. And it turned out to be surprisingly good at shedding dirt and dampening sound. The woman and her kid left her there, and she pulled the fabric corners shut and tabbed them together and spent a moment in the ringing silence of the tiny curtained roomlet, a place that would truly be hers, shared with no one for some indeterminate time. Later, she discovered all the ways that the other shelter dwellers had decorated their little spaces, which most of them called cells, with heavy irony, because every one of them had spent months or years in literal cells, the kind with concrete walls and iron bars. She'd decorate her own room, and Nadifa's children would come and poke their heads in without warning and demand stories or someone to play a game with, or ideas for pictures to draw. She wasn't exactly roped into being a babysitter, but she wasn't exactly not roped into it either. And she liked Nadifa's kids, who were just as bold and fearless as their mother, who was also a lot of fun, especially when she found a bottle of wine, sent the kids out to play in the common room, and they'd perch at the opposite ends of Salima's narrow bunk, telling lies about men, and sometimes the odd truth about their lives before the shelter would slip in. And there'd be a tear or two. But that was all right, too. Nadifa already had her work papers, and she showed Salima how to get papers of her own, which took months of patient prodding at the one working kiosk to get it to emit pieces of paper that she'd have to bring to government offices and feed into other kiosks, sneaking the trips in between her work details. The irony of being too busy working to get a work permit did not escape her, and oh, how she laughed at the irony as she scrubbed graffiti and picked up trash in the parks and cleaned city buses in the great bus barns and places even more out of the way than her Worcester strip mall. Getting her work papers wasn't the same as getting a job, but Salima was smart, and she'd spent years in the camp pursuing different qualifications by online course: hair braiding and bookkeeping, virus removal, and cat grooming. And she felt sure that there would be something she could do. And she searched the job boards with Nadifa's help, enrolled with temp agencies, submitting to their humiliating background checks, which included giving them access to her social media and email history, an invasion that was only made worse when she was later quizzed on the messages she'd saved from her parents, videos, and picture messages after they'd been separated, but before they both died. Work trickled in, a few hours here and there, shifts dwarfed by the long commutes on the bus to and from the jobs. But she cherished hope that taking these shitty jobs would build up her rep with the agencies that were sending her out, and that she'd pay her dues and start getting real shifts for real money. And she bought a couple of external batteries for her ailing phone so that she could work on the bus rides. And she and Nadifa had divided up the entirety of New England, and every day they ran hundreds of searches to look for new high-rise approvals. They came with subsidized apartments, and then they made a note of the day that the waiting list for each would open. They knew the chances of either one of them getting accepted were vanishingly small. And if they were both accepted, well, it was pretty much impossible that they'd end up in a place together. Which is why the Dorchester Towers was such a miracle. I mean, it was a bitter December, and the shelter hadn't even gotten its promised shipment of winter coats. So everyone was making do with multiple layers of sweaters and tees, which didn't read as professional, and it cost Salima a very good week-long bookkeeping job for a think tank that was quite choosy about its looks. It was closing its quarterly books, and she'd been worried sick about losing the job and worse about a black mark with the temp agency, which she'd got her several other great bookkeeping jobs that had fattened her tiny savings account more than a dozen cleaning jobs. Rattling around the strip mall with the other denizens trapped by the weather and the inadequate clothes, she pondered rating her savings for a coat, trying to figure out how much work she'd have to lose before it would be a break-even proposition, and estimating the probability that the long-delayed winter coat shipment would finally arrive before too much work was lost. Her phone let her know that she had a government message, the kind that she would have to retrieve from the kiosk in the shelter office. So she put on 3 sweaters and stuffed her hands into 3 thicknesses of socks and fought the gale force winds to the office. And standing in a puddle of her own melt water, she logged into a kiosk. They'd fixed them all, including the one that sort of worked. And now all of them were equally unreliable and prone to falling into an endless reboot cycle, and retrieved the message. She was just absorbing the impossibly good news when Nadifa staggered in from the cold and carried the smallest one close to her body for body heat. "Does that one work?" She pointed at Salima's kiosk, and Salima smiled to herself, and she wiped the screen and stepped away. "It works." Her joy was audible in her voice, and Nadifa gave her a funny look, and Salima stifled her grin. She'd tell Nadifa when. "Oh my God." Nadifa was just staring at the screen, jaw on her chest, and Salima peeked and laughed aloud. "Me too. Me too." The message was that Dorchester Towers had approved Nadifa's residency with a 2-room flat on the 42nd story that would be ready to move into in 18 months, assuming no construction delays. The rent was income indexed, meaning Nadifa and her kids would be able to afford to live there no matter what happened to them in the future. Nadifa was sometimes loud and pushy, but she was never squeaky, so it amused Salima quite a lot when Nadifa threw her hands into the air and bounced up and down on her toes, making excited noises so high-pitched that they'd have deafened a dolphin. She didn't even stop bouncing when she hugged Salima, pulling her along as she jumped up and down, laughing with delight, and Salima laughed even harder because of what she knew. She logged Nadifa out of the kiosk and logged herself in and quickly tapped her way to the official government mailbox and simply pointed wordlessly at the screen until Nadifa bent and read it, and her jaw dropped even further. "You're on the 35th floor! That's only 7 floors below us! We can take the stairs to each other's places!" Nadifa's smallest child, confused by the shouting and bouncing, chose that moment to set up a wail. And so Nadifa pulled him out of his sling and twirled him around over her head. "We're getting a place of our own, and Aunt Salima will be there too. And we'll have a kitchen, we'll have bedrooms, And she broke off and cradled the boy under one arm, using her hand to grab Salima and shake her shoulder. We'll have bathrooms, our own bathrooms, our own bathtubs, our own toilets. Our own toilets, Salima shouted, and the little one said something that was almost toilets and that set them both to laughing like drains and laughing until the tears streamed down their faces and the kids laughing with them. The Coates arrived after dinner that night, too. Salima and Nadifa clubbed together to rent a van the day they moved out, and they filled it to the ceiling with the detritus of Nadifa's years and Salima's months at the shelter. Kids' toys, clothes, shampoo bottles with enough left inside for 3 more careful washes, drawings, picture books, scrap paper for drawing, and paper dolls painstakingly cut out of old printouts from the kiosk. The car inched its way through the Boston traffic, which they could only glimpse intermittently through the tiny bits of windshield that weren't covered in shopping bags full of possessions. The band pulled into Dorchester Tower's back alley 2 hours later. It was a hot June day, and the kids needed 2 toilet breaks and several water breaks, which had blown up their plans to beat rush hour traffic, landing them squarely within it. But the 2 women were stoic. They had been on journeys that were much, much longer and far, far more difficult. The poor doors for Dorchester Tower weren't finished yet, so they had to go through the temporary wooden plywood tunnel to enter the building. The lobby was in the same condition as the doors: rough drywall, open electrical receptacles, rough concrete floor with troughs cast into it for conduit. And they lugged their things into the lobby in stages, leaving Nadifa's eldest to stand guard and watch the kids as they went back and forth to the van, trying to get everything out before the 60-minute mark, which was when they would be billed for another hour's rental. And they squeaked in. And there in the lobby, sweating and humid, they met the Dorchester Tower elevators. The touchscreen asked you for your floor and then tracked the passage of the cars up and down the shafts. Cars would touch down in the lobby and they'd hear the doors on the other side sigh open and shut, but the doors facing them never opened. They debated what to do, and eventually they decided that the doors on this side must not be working at all, and that it was another thing that had to be completed along with the lobby and the doors, and please God, air conditioning. Kids' belongings themselves, somehow they got them out of the doors again, down the alley and around the building's circumference to the lobby doors, which they couldn't help but notice were finished, chromed, shined, smudge-free, and guarded. The guard on the other side of the door buzzed the intercom when they tried the handle. He was white and wearing a semi-cop outfit, some sort of private security, which was unusual because that was the kind of job you saw brown people in most of the time. They noticed this too. Yes? We live here. We're moving in today on the, and Salima waved down the road, on the other side, but the elevators aren't working there yet. We can take the stairs after we move in, but she's on the 42nd floor and I'm on the 35th, and we have all this, and the pile of bags and clothes and drawings and children in themselves, also disreputable, especially contrasted against the shining chrome and the unsmudged glass, which now had 2 of Nadifa's kids' faces and hands smearing slowly across it. Oops. The security guard tapped the screen. Well, elevators are working. Not on that side. The elevators came down, but the doors didn't open. Step aside, please. He said it so sharply that even Nadifa's kids snapped to attention. There were some people trying to get in, pressing their thumbs to a matte plate on the door that didn't smudge. And the doors gasped open and let out a blessed gust of air conditioning that almost brought them to their knees. The beaded sweat on their backs and legs and faces and scalps spilled as much of their heat as it could in the brief wind. And then the fine people went through the door, not having looked once at them. They were preppy, a look Salima had come to understand since moving to this city of colleges and universities, with floppy blonde hair and carefully scuffed tennis outfits and sweaty, shiny faces. And the security guard greeted them and chatted with them, words inaudible through the closed doors. They were amiable enough and waved goodbye as they stepped into the elevator. And as the doors closed, Salima saw the doors on the opposite side, the doors that opened into that other lobby. The security guard gave them an irritated look and shook his head like he couldn't believe they were still hanging around, blocking his doorway. Your entrance is around back. The elevators don't work, Salima reminded him. We waited and waited. The elevators work. They just give priority to the market rent side. You'll get an elevator when none of these folks need one. Salima grasped the system and its logic in an instant. The only reason she'd been able to rent in this building was that the developer had to promise that they'd make some low-income housing available in exchange for permission to build 50 stories instead of 30 that the other buildings in the neighborhood rose to. There was a lot of this sort of thing, and she knew there were rules about low-income units, what the landlords had to provide, and what she was forbidden from doing. But now she saw an important truth. Even the pettiest amenity would be spitefully denied to the subsidy apartments unless the landlord was forced by law to provide it. She had spent enough time as Auntie Salima helping to raise Nadifa's 3 kids to recognize the logic of a mulish child who wanted to make their displeasure known. "Come on," she said, and she picked up a double armload of bags and slogged back around the building to the poor door. The apartment was wonderful. The promised luxury of a private shower and a bathtub she could lie down in if she squinched her legs and put her chin on her chest. But it was her bathtub and a single bed with a good mattress that no one else had ever slept on. And when she folded that up, she could fold down the sofa slab with its bright cushions, raise that slab up a little higher, and twist the coffee table so that its legs extended and it became a dining table. And you could seat 3 or 4 if they were all very good friends. And the walls had good insulation, and what little sound leaked in from the units around her was inaudible as long as she ran the fan and the HVAC at the lowest setting, something she could automate with the apartment's sensors, so it just happened whenever she was home. The kitchen had, quote unquote, all major appliances, just as advertised: the toaster, the dishwasher, a small thing that would hold all the dishes from a meal for one, along with a mixing bowl or one of the toaster's baking pans, the fridge. They all started working once she'd input her debit card number, and they presented her with menus of approved consumables. Okay, so this is where the Internet of Things food comes in and the blockchain food credits. And I know I take a lot of heat for being very anti-blockchain and anti-programmable money and anti-smart contracts. But it's because I read this book before the pandemic and I knew what was coming. Okay, all these appliances. All right. Approved consumables, the dishes that would work in the dishwasher, the range of food that would work with the toaster, from bread to ready meals. Now, I don't know if you've seen, but like I get all the time these sous vide, the kitchen robot, sous vide. It doesn't even look like a robot. It looks like a toaster oven. But like, to me, it's one of these. It's like, sous vide will only take your approved consumables. The washing machine would do a towel and sheets or 2 days' clothes, and there were dozens of compatible detergents she could order from its screen. This is the Amazon stuff, right? The prices all included delivery, or she could shop for herself in approved stores, but there was always the risk that she would pick up something that was incompatible with her model, and so it would be better for everyone concerned if she would do her shopping right there in the kitchen where it was most convenient for everyone. All right. And so we can imagine what that looks like, right? Like, this is all pre-lockdowns. It's so much more convenient if you just order everything from inside your kitchen. It was only a short walk to the T, and the stairs weren't that bad going down in the morning. Now, coming back up was another story. 35 floors with 70 flights of stairs. She braved them about once a week, and she told herself she was making herself healthy with such an intense aerobic workout. Having a place to live that was truly hers made a huge difference in her life. Something about the stability, the confidence, hell, just having a reliable place to do laundry every night, it all added up to the sense that she was finally exiting the endless limbo she had lived all her life. Her earliest memories were of being on the move with her parents, one camp and then another, and then an uncle's house for a while, and then another camp, and then temporary apartments, and then the crossing to America and the camp and the shelter. And all that time, she'd have the sense that her life was on hold, that she was floating around like a leaf in a breeze, sometimes snagged on a branch, and sometimes lofted up to the clouds, but never touching down, never coming to rest. And it meant that she never really thought about her life more than a few days in advance. And now in her own home, she was thinking about what her future held. Some combination of luck and self-confidence was with her, and within a month, she'd landed a full-time job as a bookkeeper for a company that serviced little mom and pop shops. And she had a half dozen clients, and she tried to see each of them once a week, even if she could have done most of the work from home. She preferred setting up in the back room of a dry cleaner or a convenience store, a little ice cream parlor, and going over the logs from the registers and the invoices and scheduling payments and chatting with the staff and the owners. And she learned that people like to be warned of impending cash flow crunches and other potential snags that she could see in their books. And within a few months, she was more like a trusted advisor than a contractor. And she remembered their birthdays and brought them cards. And then when her 25th rolled around, the owner of a vintage clothing store surprised her with a gorgeous Japanese satin jacket from the previous century. The back embroidered with a tiger that had faded beautifully over the years with a patina like a Persian rug. Nadifa's kids got into school, and Nadifa even started to fill in. The breathing room of time to herself meant that she could get a decent meal and she could take care of her hair and clothes. And she'd always had a regal bearing, but it warred with the natural overburdened mother shoulder slump and the exhaustion lines, the hands always full of kids or toys or laundry, and the strains on her beautifully tailored clothes. With some stability in her life, Nadifa's underlying nature asserted itself, and her clothes were impeccable. The lines in her face made her look serious. And then when she'd crack a wicked joke and her eye would gleam, and the contrast between the seriousness and the humor, it was like something you would see in an old painting. Nadifa's kids never lost their mischief, but school was good for them, gave them some structure to work within and fight against. They were behind, especially Abdirahim, the eldest at 12. And Nadifa rode his ass, making him work through his remedial homework assignments on his phone or even the big screen in their living room, provided the little ones could be tamped down to mere chaos. Nadifa's place had 2 rooms, one for the kids and the living room, which was exactly like Salima's, turning into a bedroom by folding down the table and folding up the sofa and folding down the bed, a magic trick that had to be done in the right order or everything snagged everything else in the middle of the room in an unholy knot that had to be carefully worked to loosen it. Things were good until the appliances started to disobey her. She did the washing machine just because she could. And once you had a kitchen full of devices that would obey you, the one that wouldn't loomed ever larger and grew less and less tolerable. Besides, she was single, and she had no interest in swiping right on the randos who never failed to disappoint. She had become an obsessive watcher of jailbreaking videos, especially since she'd followed a breadcrumb trail of ever more daring videos until she found the one that told her how to download the darknet tools that would get her to the real deal sites where you could download new firmware images, swap tips and complaints, and jolly along with thousands of lawless anarchists like herself who were toasting any damn thing they felt like. The washing machine was the hardest yet. It involved uncoupling a lot of water hoses, and she kept messing up the ring clamps, which she'd never had to use before. She bore down on it with a bookkeeper's resolve, methodically trying one variation after another, keeping a pan beneath the join, each to catch the links when she tested it out by turning on the water. And while she worked, she switched the bread making videos because that was her new passion. And now every time she saw Nadifa's kids, they begged her for whatever her latest creation was. She was making braided loaves now, an egg bread called challah, basting the rising dough with egg whites to give the crust a high gloss. A week later, she made 2 important discoveries. First, shopping for detergent in the grocery store was a lot cheaper than buying it through her machine screen. And second, that her persistent eczema was actually an allergic reaction to something in the authorized laundry soap. Spring was springing, and she'd been dreading sweating out the hot days in long sleeves to cover her flaking, itchy arms. She bought 3 vintage short-sleeved blouses and asked Nadifa to alter them to fit her as beautifully as all of Nadifa's clothes. She stopped short of jailbreaking her thermostat. For now, the thermostat was integrated with the building's sensor grid, including the camera over the door. The cameras sprinkled around her apartment. It recognized her even before she entered and spun the HVAC system up to speed before she'd even closed the door behind her, giving her just a moment of claustrophobic gasping air of the shut-up apartment before the white noise of the fan whisked a soft air current around and around. What's more, it would watch her place while she was out at work and send her a video stream if it detected anyone in a place she wasn't there. And she liked that. It comforted her. She'd been robbed twice in the shelter in Arizona and had gotten used to carrying everything she owned of any value with her at all times. It was such a relief to be able to amass more valuable goods than she could easily carry. The elevator was another matter. When she'd moved into Dorchester Towers, the building had only been in service for a few weeks, and it was at less than half occupancy. As the apartments had filled up, the number of market rate people using the elevators had increased to the point where it could take a full 45 minutes to get a ride up to the 35th floor. And when the elevator finally came for the poor door's lobby, there were so many people waiting, she'd end up riding in a squash of people, face in somebody's sweaty armpit. And if she was lucky, she'd be pressed against a wall behind her and not up against some strange man. She was nearly certain that at the times it had seemed like she was being creeped on and it had been an accident of the press of bodies and not the actual creepiness, but she couldn't be sure. And anyway, it still felt really creepy. One day she was sitting in Nadifa's living room drinking tea and watching Nadifa's eldest do his extra homework. And she and Nadifa had been complaining about the elevators for a good 20 minutes. It was a well-established subject among all subsidy tenants, and they could really work themselves up about it when Ibrahim, Nadifa's eldest son, looked up from his math. Mama, why don't we just use elevator captains? Do your homework. Nadifa operated on pure reflex when it came to her kids and homework, but after a moment she added, what's an elevator captain? Ibrahim's smile was luminous. Oh, it's so cool. If you're the first person in the elevator in Japan, you're the elevator captain. You have to hold the door open until everyone boards, and then you have to press the door closed and all the floor buttons. And if the elevator captain gets out before the elevator is empty, the next closest person has to do it. Where did you hear this? Well, we did a unit on unspoken rules in social studies. I'm doing an extra credit on the unspoken rules of refugee detention in America. The teacher loves that. She gets all solemn when I talk about it, and the other refugee kids think it's hilarious. I don't think it's hilarious. Nadifa was deadpan. I think it's very respectful. And she turned back to Salima and opened her mouth to start talking again. And then she turned back to Ibrahim. Why would we use an elevator captain? His smile was twice as big. We could just take turns staying in the elevator in the morning and in the afternoon during the busy times. It won't stop for a poor if there's a rich who needs it, sure. But if there's a poor in it, it won't stop for the rich until the poor is out. Nadifa mouthed a poor to Salima and rolled her eyes. And Salima covered a smile. The kids knew what was what, and they told it like it was. And meanwhile, the plan was dawning on Salima and Nadifa. And it was weirdly elegant, simple. So there weren't many things that could go wrong. And plus, it was used to the fact that rich people didn't want to have to even see some of them used against them. Do your homework. Nadifa used her stern voice, but her smile to Salima was the twin of Abdi Ibrahim's, and Salima mouthed, smart kid. And Sadifa nodded. The 2 weeks of the elevator captains was the best in the building's short history. From 7:30 to 8:45 in the morning and 5:15 to 6:30 at night, there was effectively one elevator exclusively reserved for the use of the poor side of the building, serving the 10 floors out of the 56. That left 15 elevators for the rich people to use. And so at first, they may not have even noticed that their unseen neighbors living in the building's off-limit spaces were setting up and down in a matter of minutes rather than waiting an hour or trudging the stairs. But someone figured it out. Nadifa called Salima at work, using anger to mask her worry. They were waiting in the lobby, 3 security guards, 3. And of course, it had to be Ibrahim, who is the elevator captain. It was Ibrahim's idea, and he was the most enthusiastic captain in the building. Salima had even bought him a little peaked military cap from her vintage store client stock, and he wore it in a jaunty angle during his shifts, looking almost indecently cute. He just brought the elevator back down to the ground floor and was mashing the closed door when the lightning reflexes of a 13-year-old raised on video games when the other door opened, the rich person door, the door that was never, ever opened while any of them were in the car. And that the 3 security guards demanded Ibrahim's name and papers, and when he told them that they were in his home on the 42nd floor, they refused to let him go get them. And instead, they took him down to the basement using their security guard fobs to override the elevator controls. They locked him in a windowless room with a reinforced door and conspicuous cameras in each ceiling corner and slammed the door on him. And after a long time, they came in to question him. He knew that he was late getting home and that his mom would be getting worried, though not frantic because Nadifa didn't do frantic. Furious, yes. Frantic, never. Furious was a lot more worrying, honestly. And that was the thought that was in his head when he explained the whole elevator captain business to security guards who questioned him and denied him water or the use of the toilet until it seemed that every drop of water in his body was in his bladder and desperately trying to escape. They went over the story again and again, and he began to cry because it reminded him of the questioning they'd had in the camps when he was tiny and again when they got to America when he was small. And those had been hard times with his father dying. and refusing to show it and sitting up ramrod straight and answering question after question and praying they would detect his illness and use it as an excuse to turn away, wouldn't detect his illness and use it as an excuse to turn away the family. And the memory of that overcame him, and he sobbed and he couldn't answer the questions anymore. And that's when they called Nadifa finally, and she was furious, but not at him. And she yelled about re traumatizing a child and demanded their names and their badge numbers, and even got the phone and recorded it all, and even stopped, and even him crying, which made him ashamed, but still he couldn't stop. There would be a reckoning, Nadifa swore. And Salima thought she was probably right, but that they would get the worst of it. And they did. The elevators had cameras in them, of course, and it took the face recognition software all of 10 seconds to produce a list of the poor door residents who'd used the elevator captain system with times and dates of each ride. And it took a day for the building management to merge those records with form letters informing everyone who'd participated that they were in violation of their lease, which forbade tampering with, reverse engineering, disabling, bypassing, disconnecting, spoofing, undermining, damaging, or subverting any of the building systems. Further violations would result in eviction proceedings. Be warned, be told. It was humiliating to be addressed in this manner, even for Salima, who had been subjected to the most humiliating of depredations over the years: strip searches and confiscations, collective punishments, and scouring of her most private data and memories to find an excuse to deny her humanity. It burned. After years of spinning in place, she'd finally started her life in earnest with a place and a job and friends who were nearly family. And this was a reminder that her current life was a tissue-thin surface covering the world she lived before. And for her whole life, the world had been divided. The people around her, people who knew her and who she was. And most of those were people who wished her well and supported her, and she supported them back. And some of those people were bad people and meant her harm. Camps were not paradise, but even for them, it was personal. But there was another world, vast beyond her knowing, of people who didn't know her at all, but who held her life in their hands. The ones who thronged in demonstrations against refugees, the politicians who raged about the scourge of terrorists hidden among the refugees, and the ones who talked in code about assimilation, too much, too fast, and the soldiers and cops and guards who pointed guns at her and barked orders at her, the bureaucrats she never saw who rejected her paperwork for cryptic reasons she could only guess at, and the bureaucrats who looked at her in the eye and rejected her paperwork and refused to explain themselves. And now there was a new group in the latter class, distant as the causes of the weather, the building management company and its laser printer, blasting out eviction notices, threats to people whose names they didn't even know and whose faces they'd never even seen, for transgressions so petty and rules so demeaning. The elevator captains had been a good chuckle, a way for everyone from the poor doors and the poor floors to feel like they were mice outsmarting the cats. And the letters put them in their place. Roaches facing exterminators. The elevators weren't any better programmed than the disher or the boulangism or the thermostat or anything else, really. The big difference was access. She could take her disher to pieces in the kitchen without having to explain herself to anyone, but let her try that in the hallway in sight of the cameras and her neighbors, and the situation would be very different. To take out the elevators, she'd need to take out the cameras and then work out the very small hours, and still she would risk discovery. So she'd need a disguise, a maintenance outfit, and maybe she could also take out the lights and replace them with working lights. And she began to visualize the tableau, her down on one knee in shapeless coveralls with a hard hat pulled way down and the lights out and the illumination from floodlights that would shine right into the eyes of anyone who tried to snoop. It was a fun daydream, and she enjoyed the game of thinking somehow she might catch her and she might avoid being caught. It was an especially good way to recover from the exhaustion of trudging 35 flights up or the frustration of waiting for 45 minutes with a cooling pot of tagine from the corner deli in her hand. The smell was driving her crazy. And she pushed around the wreckage of her tagine with a glass of cheap and delicious Retsine, a favorite among so many refugees who'd made the passage through Greece, and now a staple of refugees who hadn't, thanks to its popularity in the camps. And she'd looked out her tiny window at Boston far below, the Charles swollen to its levees, and the ant-like people swarming at home under the streetlights as autumn's early night fell swiftly upon them. And she daydreamed about high-vis and work lights and about the tools she'd use to remove the firefighter's override panel to reveal the USB port beneath, and the subtle ways in which she could alter the building's algorithms so that the faceless people would never discover her intrusion. There was a ding at the door, and the screen showed her Abdibrahim, weirdly distorted by the camera's autofocus on his face, which is a good foot below the adult height camera mounting. And she waved the door, unlocked, and he let himself in, looking from her to the tagine, to the wine, then back to her. Have you eaten? It was a phrase she remembered her mother saying to everyone who came through the door, even when there was no food to share. It had irritated her once, and now she said it automatically on those rare occasions when someone came through her door. Yes, Abdibrahim said it too quickly, but you're still hungry. It wasn't a question. She remembered being a 13-year-old, hungry all the time, and she got him a plate and spooned some tagine onto it, and then she found a pita and popped it in her toaster to warm it, and when it was done, he looked at her with wide eyes. Yours works? It took a moment for her to figure out what he meant. The toaster. It works. I fixed it. And then, with a little pride, the dishwasher, too. And the thermostat. And the fridge. Show me. Eat first. The food barely touched his throat on the way down. She felt like she would probably make him eat slowly in her capacity in loco parentis, but she was as eager to show him as he was to be shown. And when he said, show me, it made her realize that she'd been bursting with secret knowledge she'd wanted more than anything to share. And when he was done, she put his dishes in the dishwasher and gestured him over to her so that she could show him the boot screen. And she put the disher through its paces with the fanciful graphics she'd installed of anthropomorphic dishes with bad attitudes, showering angrily in the trademark disher spray. And he clapped and laughed and demanded to see the rest and then to be shown how to do it. They say you don't really know how to do something until you can teach it to someone else. And as Salima looked up the instructions again, she realized how much of it had just been recipe following the first time around and how much she'd come to understand since, so that the steps made sense. And she was able to explain to Abdibrahim the why of each step, nearly as much as the what and the how, and her heart beat and her blood sang with the experience of mastery. This was the antidote, she realized, to the feeling of distant people whom she'd never meet, who held the power of everything over her, to be able to control the computers around her rather than being controlled by them. You see, she said at last, as the realization came out of this blue to her and left her wonderstruck and thunderstruck, feeling like a revelating prophet. You see, if someone wants to control you with a computer, they have to put the computer where you are and they are not, so you can access that computer without supervision. A computer you can access without supervision is a computer you can change, because all these computers are the same deep down. And when you get down to the programs underneath the skin, a toaster and a dishwasher and a thermostat, they're all the same computer in different cases. And once you seize control over that computer, all of them are yours. And as the words left her mouth, her messianic fervor was replaced by nagging self-doubt. The knowledge that she was shouting triumphantly at a small boy who had only gotten out of temporary refugee housing a few months before, and she felt foolish and small. But then she saw a gleam in Abdibrahim's eyes, and it was the same as the gleam in her eyes, and she knew that the two of them were sharing the vision. Our dishwasher and cooker haven't worked in weeks, he said. Oh dear, she hadn't even thought of that. She had reflexively kept her work a secret from Nadifa because she was doing something potentially dangerous, and she didn't want Nadifa to point this out. But that was before her vision. We should do something about that. She held out her hand. Let's go see your mother. And she remembered to take the Retsine with her on the way out the door. Perhaps Nadifa would have been upset at the idea of hacking the family's appliances, but that was before she had spent 2 weeks parenting without a toaster or a dishwasher. The hardship of eating everything cold or shelling out money she didn't have for takeaways had softened any concern she might have had. And as she watched Abdibrahim show his sister how to jailbreak all of the apartment's major appliances, she radiated a motherly pride. He's good at it, Salima said. I only showed him once, and she gestured. Do you think we'll get in trouble with the building? I mean, they own the appliances. Salima shrugged. They were getting a share of the money we spent before for the special bread and soap and so on. But with both companies bankrupt, they won't be expecting any new money. So now if the companies do ever come back from bankruptcy and still no one is here using their products, Nadifa nodded. Well, that would definitely be trouble. She watched her kids, who had the cover off the thermostat and were avidly watching a video on the big screen next to it, where a person whose body had been mapped to a giant animated rabbit was explaining how to get it to fall back into debug mode, from which it would accept commands that let you override central commands to it. But if it's just the two of us, will they ever find out? Salima shrugged again. If the system is designed well, then yes. I mean, it would be very weird for our apartments to generate much lower revenue than any of the others. I once did a job where I saw that two of the checkouts at a pharmacy were generating 20% less money than the rest. And at first, I thought it was they were broken. But even when they were serviced and even when they were moved, they were always 20% down from average. And then they got sent away for analysis and they'd been hacked and they were being skimmed. But you're good at your job and you care about that sort of thing. Unspoken. No one good at their job who cared about anything was involved at the poor floors of Dorchester Towers. Well, I'm sure they care about money. Perhaps they're not so well designed. She pondered, I don't know. I mean, they certainly care a lot about making money, so the parts that help them make as much money would probably have the most attention. I'll search for it. There must be other people in this situation. The kids successfully tested their modifications to the thermostat and closed it up, looking this way and that for something else to attack. Don't forget the refrigerator, Nadifa said. That's a fun one. Very tricky. And they raced to the screen and started typing, sending Idle, the eldest girl, to read the model number off the label on the inside of the fridge door. Salima knew that the kids wouldn't stop at their own apartment, of course, and she'd pass them in the hallway sometimes, rushing from one apartment to the next. The feeling this gave her was hard to pin down, sort of pride and excitement, but also trepidation and a sick, impotent sensation. The echo of the slow roll her stomach had done when she came home to find the laser printed threat stuck to her door, to all the doors. On the elevator, Salima heard whispers. Have you done your place yet? It was so easy. I'm baking bread again. We found some beautiful dishes at a thrift shop. Such a treat to be able to wash them in the machine. My little boy did it. So easy. And then one night at her door, a knock at her door, urgent and low, and she opened it and found Abdi Ibrahim wide-eyed and stressed, and her pulse quickened and her armpits slickened, and she thought, oh no, this is it. Tell me, she said, bringing him in. I did the same as always, a toaster. I've done so many, but something went wrong, and now it won't even turn on. She whooshed a sigh of relief. He'd bricked some poor person's toaster, but he hadn't gotten them all evicted. Well, let's go see. There were message boards for this eventuality, of course. Abdi Ibrahim wasn't the first person to brick an appliance. There were tricks to get it to boot into an emergency shell from which the original factory operating system could be laboriously reinstalled, and then they could start over. She used Abdi Ibrahim as her helper, reading her instructions and searching for help when they got unexpected error messages. The toaster's owner was an old Serbian man who'd never spoken a word to her, though they'd shared elevators and waited in the lobby together often enough. She had assumed that he was a racist, but that was usually the reason that white people didn't speak to her. But she didn't take it personally. Some people were just ignorant. But it seemed that he was painfully shy and awkward and not necessarily racist. And he offered them tea and served them biscuits, and he counted out carefully from a packet he took from a nearby empty cupboard in which she spotted a huge jar of food bank peanut butter and not much else. He excused himself to use the toilet 4 times while they worked, and she heard the painful dribble of an old man struggling with an enlarged prostate. And at one point, she was ready to give up. The toaster wouldn't even show her a bootloader screen. It was in worse shape than when she started, but the old man looked so concerned, and she knew he wouldn't be able to afford a new toaster. She imagined the cold meals of biscuits and peanut butter he'd been surviving on since Boulagism had shut down. So she and Abdi Ibrahim went back to step 1, checking everything, very methodically. And finally, they noticed that the toaster was actually an earlier model than the ones that everyone else had in the building. Cosmetically identical, but with a model number that was a single letter off. And when she searched on that, she found a completely different set of instructions. And these worked. And it was after 1 a.m. when they finally finished. But she still went down to her place and came back up with the makings of grilled cheese sandwiches on homemade bread. And they had a midnight feast that gave her heartburn. But it was worth it. The next time, it was a kid she didn't even know tapping at her door and asking for help with the bricked screen. Abdi Ibrahim had apparently told his army of Dorchester Tower irregulars that she was a reliable source of level 2 emergency tech support. The third time it happened, she realized she needed to get ahead of the phenomenon if she ever wanted to have another moment to herself. Abdi Ibrahim. She stared intently at the kid until he met her eyes. Nadifa's presence helped. Yes, Auntie? He only called her that when he was in trouble. The rest of the time it was Salima, or with learned American familiarity, Sally, which was a new one on her that she wasn't entirely happy about. The way you are doing this, you and your friends, it's dangerous. You're going to get caught, and you're going to get people who live here caught too. Do you remember the elevator captains and what happened? Yes, Auntie. We don't want that again, do we? No, Auntie. We don't want to get everyone here thrown out onto the streets either. No, Auntie. So I want you to get all of your friends to come to my place tomorrow after school, 5 p.m. Tell them anyone who doesn't come is not allowed to jailbreak anything ever again. He registered surprise. You mean that if we come, we can still jailbreak? She smiled and met Nadifa's eye. Oh, yes, my boy. We're just not going to stop. We're not going to stop breaking the rules. We're just going to be smart about it. Okay, so I think I've got about halfway through. That's 50 pages in. It's about a 100-page story. So, yeah. I hope this helps people make sense of what I've been trying to talk about and the frame that I talk about it in. Because my initial research was tied to looking up blockchain and refugees. And, I think the plan for this fourth industrial revolution and displacement is really mass displacement. And one of the things I was trying to really advance in the 4-piece subseries that I wrote was that unhoused people are being manufactured as social impact commodities. Because what's not in here yet is that like all of the smart appliances and the data tied to that, like that will be linked to digital identity and rating people for social credit, not just like to control their movements, which is something I think a lot of people have a handle on, this idea of Internet of Things technology and social credit score controlling movements, but actually creating simulations that are used for risk analysis, for state intelligence, and then also for the financial, for the futures markets. It's all really very, very connected. And it doesn't just live in books, even though that this is fiction. I think we're on the verge of getting there. They just haven't been able to scale the digital identity yet. And they haven't been able to create the standards for all of the ubiquitous computing that like the boulangism toasters that they can be in every country. And then again, controlling your food, controlling what you could put in them, marking everything up. As she mentioned, I don't know if you caught that about the soap and being not only more expensive, the authorized soap for these special appliances, but also that was giving her eczema, that these systems will be controlling the terraforming, of life. And, I think it's really important that the story includes, the kids as sort of main feature characters, because they're the ones who are going to be moving into the space and having to navigate it. But, clearly there's a lot of really bright kids. So, the adults and the kids need to have to work together on this. So I'm going to put the link to my PDF in the Google Doc of the 4-part series. It's like 100 pages, but I would say half of that is images, because I think having screenshots and things helps tell the story. But it's probably about 50 pages of text, and it's broadly set within the context of displacement, because I think the use of economic warfare and straight up warfare and displacement, disconnecting people from their social support networks, putting them in different places, making them reliant on these systems, is part of the plan for destabilization and managing the transition, so that it's hard for people to get coordinated and to build their support networks. So anyway, I'll put the link in. I would appreciate it if you guys could spend some time, if you appreciated the story, looking it over and seeing how it connects, and giving me some feedback. And if you know of people who are in that position, like, share it. Some of the bit of feedback that I've gotten on this piece is actually a friend who had to relocate from Ukraine to Sweden, and this person has interesting insights into how they're being managed in all of the systems. So anyway, thanks for joining in. I'll do part 2 probably within a week. I'm going to be taking a break this weekend, and I'll probably be away from my computer for a week. But I'll try to get this finished out before we head out, and read it again in a couple days. So share it around. All right. Bye.